after soccer. Okay.
At least we have trees here.
Now, does anybody not have a map of where we're going to be? Okay.
Everybody okay? All right, so thank you for being here today. Ann and I have been really excited about this opportunity to share more information about some of the people from this community who served during World War I. I'll give you a brief overview of the tour just so we all know what we're doing. You have your map in front of you so you know the stops that we'll be making. Some of these different stops will be require us to walk over grass and some uneven ground. So if anybody's not comfortable with that, either Ann or I can stay with you in another area and give you the same information that you will receive at the actual grave site. The last two stops that you'll see there on the map are a little further south, which is near the mausoleum. If you parked here, you're welcome to drive there and meet us there. And then we will also be able to enter the mausoleum at the end of the tour, and you'll have as much time as you'd like to be able to be there. And one last thing is there is the porta potty that's near the office is open, but that is now on the other end of our tour. So just so you know that that is available.
And if there's an emergency, we exit through the gate.
The only gate down there.
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't happen.
You've been to too many trainings.
Okay, and I want to put my welcome in too. I'm Ann Deegan. I'm not with the library. I keep corralling people into things research-wise. But I'm a local historian and do a lot with late 19th century, early 20th century U.S. history. And I'm sure most all of you know that we have a book called Redlands in World War I that's out now. That's what stimulated this particular tour. So I just want to say a few words about the history of the cemetery. You may be familiar with it, but the first burials were in 1887, and we will be in the old area. You will also see some markers that predate 1887. Those were either graves of people who were brought in and buried, or they just put a marker up. The cemetery today is about 44 acres and 30,000 burials. There's a lot of room still within the cemetery for burials. It was private until 1918 when the city acquired the cemetery. So it is now a city-owned cemetery. There's not that many, from what I understand, in the country. Now, with World War I, the war started in Europe about 1914, and the U.S. did not get in until 1917, April 1917, and then it was over in November of 1918. Short time period for the United States, but still a very lethal and nasty war. Over 800 men and women left Redlands to do their part in the war effort. Some joined the military in service. Some of them were in the YMCA and got overseas near the front lines. Some of them were in the Red Cross. We had nurses. We had a lot of different people out there participating. 40 people from Redlands gave their life in service to their country during that war. And some of them were brought back from overseas to be buried here. Some of them were in this country and were brought back for burial. We're going to tell few stories of these men and women today. We're going to start here at the Veterans Circle. Since we're standing in the shade right now, I'll give you the first pitch about the circle itself. This was originally called the American Legion Circle. It is now called the Veterans Circle. And the very first burial that was here was Francisco Martinez's burial, and he went by Frank. Now, when we go through our tour, you'll see some flags. We've tried to mark the graves that we're talking about today, so you can kind of spot them easily. I'm going to come back to talk about Frank Martinez's story as we finish up with the circle here. Some people that were buried here died in service, but many of them were veterans that died later. And as you go through, you're going to see Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, mainly. Then they ran out of space. And so a lot of the veterans, like a Civil War veteran, would not have lived here at the time that they were in the Civil War because the town didn't exist. And one thing that I want to also mention is, you see all these little medallions right here? Some of you may be familiar with them. There's really three kinds. There's a fourth one. There's only one of them though. But the three most common ones in here, if you see American Legion on one of them, that was put in by the American Legion group for World War I veterans. There's one that says SPAM, SPAM. That's the Spanish-American War Veterans Group, and those markers say Philippines and Cuba. That would have been 1898 to 1902. And then there's one that just says g.a.r, Grand Army of the Republic. That's the Union Veterans marker. And you will see some of those in here as well. So the next thing I want to do is start with the first person that we're going to talk about. And of the two flag ones right there, I don't think we need to necessarily stand right over the top of that because of the sun. But Caleb Pearson. Caleb Pearson was a private. Maria, you have the photos, don't you? The illustration.
I passed around the photos
Okay,
of the
good.
three different
The three marker photo
markers.
is coming around so you can see that. Caleb Pearson was a Redlander. He was literally born here in 1894, attended Redlands High School. He was single when the war broke out, working as a farm laborer in Redlands. He was drafted, and on October 3rd, 1917, he and about 20 other young men boarded a train here in town and went off to Camp Lewis, now Fort Lewis in Washington, for training. Later, many of them were shipped down to Camp Kearney in San Diego area. It doesn't exist anymore, for further training. Well, this young man married in April of 1918, and he married Isel Beeler. And there's a photo of the couple.
Oh, actually, no, we don't have the photo.
Oh, I think I have it. This is Isel Beeler and Caleb Pearson, husband and wife. Very young couple.
Those are our grandfathers.
Yes, yes. And by September 1918, he was in France, and he'd already been over the top, which meant he'd been out of the trenches into the fighting. And then after September 1918, there was silence. The family didn't hear anything from him, and they didn't know what had happened. And when cases like that came up, people tried the Red Cross, they tried the government, where is our son, where is our son, on and on and on and on. Finally, in October, the Red Cross said, oh, he was wounded, but they still didn't know what happened to him. It took until March of 1919 before the family found out that he had actually died on October 5th in the Argonne fighting. And so 6 months. Now, left a wife, a very young wife, and family. And to add even worse, Isel Beeler, who married Caleb Pearson, her brother Omer Beeler went off on the same draft train. He died overseas, and they didn't find out about his death for months. So that's the only family I know of in town that had a double tragedy like that, or connected through Isel Beeler. Now, you should be asking yourself a question here. If he died in France, why is he buried here? Because in about November 1919, families that had sons or husbands that died overseas and were buried overseas were given three options. You can leave your son or husband buried overseas in American cemetery. You can have their remains brought over to a national cemetery like Arlington, or you can have the remains brought all the way back to the home cemetery. And to give you an idea of what happened here, 10 Redlands men, and when I say Redlands, I mean the general area, Yucaipa, Mentone, Crafton, Highland, Loma Linda. 10 of them were left overseas. One was buried at sea, an additional one. 2 are buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and 13 were brought back to this country, with 7 of the 13 here in this cemetery. Now, this didn't happen, these reburials, until about 1921, 1922. Now, can you picture the town? It's several years after the end of the war. They're trying to forget the tragedies and everything. In start coming remains from overseas, and seven funeral services, 7 burials here in the cemetery. So that was what happened with Caleb Pearson. He was reburied January 8th, 1922. He was almost the last of the reburials. So we want to thank the family for sharing their photos with us. And again, some of these stories you can find in the book, which we can push because we get no money from it. Royalties go to the library.
Yay.
Okay, now, when you get a chance, you can walk by and see. And the other flag is right next to him. It was another young man who died overseas and was buried here as well, brought back. Now, this is Francisco Martinez's marker. Francisco, or Frank Martinez, was also born in Redlands in 1887. He was a laborer, he was single, he was living with his family at the time the war broke out. There's not as much information on him at the present time, whether he was drafted or enlisted, but he ends up at Camp Lewis again, training. And from there, we find him in the 160th Infantry overseas, probably in the Argonne battles that were going on. The family heard by telegram that he had died in December of 1918. Or they heard in December 1918 that he had died in October 23rd. Now that's pretty good timing, you know, we don't have a lot of instantaneous communication then. And he was 31 years old when he died. His reburial occurred October 28th, 1921, and the American Legion here in town was founded in November of 1919. The overall American Legion group was organized in 1919 nationally to help World War I veterans. So Redlands was fast in organizing their own group, and they took charge pretty much of Frank Martinez's burial. He was the very first one buried in this circle.
How come he doesn't have an American Legion?
Because, thank you. It turns out in 2015 when I was doing research on him that he didn't even have a marker.
Oh, wow.
And I asked the cemetery, I said, I know he's buried here. They looked in their records, they said he's buried right there.
Wow.
He didn't have a marker, and 6 other men did not have markers in this circle. Some Civil War veterans, some Spanish-American War and World War I. So, in 2015, Sam Irwin, who was with the American Legion Post 106 here, got busy, and he spearheaded an effort. The markers came from the Montecito Memorial Park, engraving by Ryan Gallagher. City of Redlands waived the fees. The circle was cleaned up by the Elks Club and East Valley Young Marines. And they just hustled and got this done. All 7 markers got done. So they're here, and in the Memorial Day 2015, we had, the service was held here and honored the markers being put in and in general. 97 years after into World War I, he finally got a marker. So that was really nice. Okay, I'm gonna pass the baton to Maria now.
So our next stop is going to be Florence Billings, and she's going to be down this lane here. It's just grass and dirt, so just watch your step. And if you want to come with me, anybody who doesn't want to walk all the way down with me can stay with Anne over here at the gate.
Yeah, in the shade.